Abigail Whitmore did not weep the night her husband walked into his own harvest supper, with another woman's hand resting on his arm and her pearl necklace fastened at that woman's throat. She stood still, her gloved fingers curled at her sides, and she let every person in that room see exactly what kind of man Nathaniel Ashford truly was. If you've ever been betrayed by someone, you gave everything to stay until the very end, because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 had been generous to Virginia. The corn stood tall along the lower field. Tobacco rows ran clean and straight from the tree line, all the way to the creek road. The sky above Ashford Hall held the last warm color of the season, a deep amber that settled over the estate, like a blessing no one had earned, and only one person had worked hard enough to deserve. Abigail Whitmore Ashford had planned the harvest supper for 6 weeks. She had ordered the candles from Richmond beeswax, not tallow, because Nathaniel always said tallow smoke made the dining hall smell like a tavern. She had written the menu herself, consulted with Mrs. Patton in the kitchen, approved the flowers, arranged the seating cards, and spent 3 full mornings reviewing the household accounts to make certain there was enough left in the estate fund to cover the evening without drawing on her private reserve again. There was not enough. There was never enough anymore. She had drawn on her private reserve again. She dressed without help that evening. The other ladies of Virginia took an hour with their maids' pins and powder and elaborate arrangements of curled hair. Abigail dressed in 20 minutes. She chose the blue silk her mother had sent from Philadelphia, pinned her hair back simply, and fastened at her throat the pearl necklace her father had given her the morning she left his house to become Nathaniel Ashford's wife. "You are going into a proud man's house," her father had said, working the clasp at the back of her neck with patient fingers. "You will hold it together. You will not let him know how much of it rests on you. That is not weakness, Abigail. That is the work of a woman who understands what she is protecting." She had understood then. She understood even better now. Abigail came downstairs at 7:30 when the first carriages were already rolling up the gravel drive. She stood at the foot of the main staircase and greeted the arriving families herself. The Merriweathers, the Dunham brothers, Judge Calloway, and his wife, old Colonel Finch, who always smelled of pipe tobacco and never remembered her name, but always remembered Nathaniel's father's name, which he said loudly 3 or 4 times every time he visited, as though the dead man needed the reminder. She smiled at each of them. She asked after their children and their harvests and their mothers. She directed them toward the parlor where the first glasses were being poured. Nathaniel had not yet come down. She told herself he was delayed. She told herself he had lost track of the hour. She had been telling herself versions of those same things for the better part of 2 years, and she had grown very skilled at believing them just long enough to get through whatever event was in front of her. By 8 o'clock, every important family in the county was gathered in Ashford Hall's main rooms. The candles burned bright. The musicians played a slow reel in the corner. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread moved through the house like something rich and earned. And Nathaniel Ashford still had not come down. Abigail was standing near the window speaking with Margaret Dunham about the unusually dry August when she heard the front door open. She heard it the way she heard most things in that house, with her whole body. First her mind arriving a half-second later to make sense of what her nerves already knew. She turned. Nathaniel came through the door of the main hall with Clara Bellamy on his arm. Not through the family corridor. Not through the side passage he might have used if he were trying to be discreet. Through the front door of his own house in front of 60 guests, with Clara Bellamy's gloved hand resting in the crook of his elbow, and Clara Bellamy's dark eyes sweeping the room with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has already won. Clara wore a cream gown with yellow ribbon trim. Her hair was dressed in the fashionable style, high and soft, with small curls at the temples. Around her throat, catching the candlelight with a warmth that Abigail recognized before she had finished turning around, was a strand of pearls. Her pearls. The room did not go silent all at once. It went quiet in pieces. A conversation stopping here, a glass being lowered, their heads, turning shoulders, shifting, the slow collective realization moving through the guests like cold water rising. Margaret Dunham stopped speaking mid-sentence about August rainfall. Judge Calloway set down his glass. Nathaniel walked Clara to the center of the room and he looked, and this was the part that Abigail would return to many times in the months that followed, testing it, examining it, trying to understand it. He looked happy. Not defiant, not ashamed, not braced for a fight. Happy. The way a man looks when he has finally stopped pretending and does not yet understand what the pretending was costing him. "Good evening," Nathaniel said to the room as though nothing were unusual. "I hope the supper has been everything you all deserved. Clara will be joining us tonight." No title, no explanation, just Clara Bellamy wearing Abigail's pearls standing in Abigail's house at the supper Abigail had planned and paid for. Abigail stood where she was. She did not move toward him. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Clara. She looked at Nathaniel, and she looked at him with such complete steadiness that several guests later said they had never in their lives seen a woman appear so utterly in control of herself in a moment that would have broken most people in half. "Nathaniel," she said. Her voice carried without effort. The room was quiet enough that it did not need to. He turned to look at her. Something moved across his face, not guilt, not quite, more like a man remembering a detail he had intended to address later and was displeased to be reminded of now. "Abigail," he said. "I'm glad you're down. I know who she is," Abigail said. She walked toward him then, not quickly, not with the hurried step of a woman trying to get to her husband before something worse could happen. Slowly. The way a woman walks when she has already decided what she is going to say, and is taking the time to let the room understand that she has decided it. She stopped 3 feet from him. Close enough that he would have to look at her directly. Not so close that it could be read as anything other than what it was, a woman standing in her own house facing her own husband, speaking plainly. "That pearl necklace," Abigail said, "was a gift from my father. He clasped it at my throat the morning I left Philadelphia to come here." She paused. "To become your wife." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "Mr. Ashford gave it to me as—" "I didn't ask you," Abigail said without looking at her, still looking at Nathaniel. "I'm speaking to my husband." The room held its breath. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The happiness she had seen on his face when he walked in had shifted into something more familiar. The brittle, cornered pride of a man who had prepared for a private confrontation and found himself in a public one instead. "This is not the time," he said low and tight. "You chose the time," Abigail said. "You walked through the front door of this house with another woman on your arm at a supper I planned in a room full of people who have known my family for 30 years. You chose the time, Nathaniel. I am simply keeping pace." "Clara understands me," he said. He said it the way men say things when they are trying to end an argument by reaching for something unanswerable. "She always has. Better than you ever. She understands that you are an heir to an estate," Abigail said. "That is not the same thing." Someone near the window made a small sound. She did not look to see who. "That pearl," she continued, and her voice stayed level, stayed clean, stayed exactly as measured as her father had taught her a Whitmore voice should be in a room full of people watching, "was paid for by my father's bank. As was the roof above your head tonight. As were the candles burning in this room. As was the meal these families are about to sit down to. As were your horses, your accounts at the Richmond Merchant House, your tobacco shipment last autumn that would not have cleared without my signature on the guarantee." She turned then, just briefly, and looked at Clara Bellamy directly for the first time. Clara had gone very still. "You are welcome to the pearl," Abigail said quietly, "if you are willing to carry the debt that paid for it." She turned and walked back toward the window. Behind her, the room remained completely silent for a long moment. Then the quiet broke not into argument, not into scandal, but into the careful, deliberate sound of 60 people deciding simultaneously to look elsewhere, speak of other things, and pretend with enormous Virginia politeness that they had not just witnessed exactly what they had witnessed. Nathaniel said nothing else that evening. Clara sat at the far end of the supper table and ate without speaking. Abigail took her usual seat, spoke pleasantly with Judge Calloway's wife about the schoolhouse that was reportedly being planned in the next county, and ate her supper with the careful appetite of a woman who intended to need her strength. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the writing desk in her room, the small one near the east window where the morning light came in earliest, and she opened the household ledger she kept locked in the bottom drawer. Not the household ledger Nathaniel knew about. Her ledger. The one she had been keeping since the first year of the marriage, when she had realized that the accounts Nathaniel showed her, and the accounts she could read between them, were not the same document. She went through every page. She already knew most of it. She had been building the picture for months quietly, without urgency, the way her father had taught her to build a financial picture, not by looking for what was wrong, but by looking for what could not be explained. There was a great deal that could not be explained. The feed merchant in Richmond had been paid twice for 3 separate deliveries, and the second payments were in a hand that was not the estate bookkeeper's. The dressmaker's bill, addressed to no one in particular, paid from the general household account, was for gowns cut for a woman narrower than Abigail across the shoulders. There were 2 payments to a townhouse owner in Fredericksburg listed in the ledger under miscellaneous property maintenance for a property that did not belong to Ashford Hall. She read until 2 in the morning. Then she closed the ledger, locked it back in the drawer, and sat for a while with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the dark shape of the window. She was not angry. She had passed through anger some months ago in a quiet evening, just like this one, when she had first begun to understand the full shape of what had been happening. Anger was a fire, and fire wanted fuel, and she did not intend to spend herself that way. What she felt now was something quieter and considerably more useful. She felt clear. In the morning, she wrote a letter to Elias Mercer in Philadelphia. Elias Mercer had been her father's lawyer and financial advisor for 20 years before he became hers. He was 63 years old, compact and precise, with a mind like a set of good scales, perfectly balanced, absolutely reliable, quietly devastating when required to be. Her father trusted him without reservation. Abigail trusted him for the same reasons her father did, and for one additional reason. When she had first come to him 2 years ago, with her private concerns about the Ashford accounts, Elias had not told her she was being foolish or emotional. He had asked her to show him the numbers. She showed him the numbers. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Leave the ledger with me. I'll write to you within the fortnight." He had written within 10 days. Now she wrote to him again. The letter was brief. She told him the evening had proceeded as she had anticipated it might. She told him she was ready to begin. She asked him to have the necessary documents prepared. She sealed the letter with plain wax, no crest, no flourish, and set it on the writing desk to be carried out with the morning post. Then she went to bed because she intended to sleep, and because a woman who intended to dismantle a man's financial empire with legal instruments and careful patience had no use for exhaustion. She slept deeply without dreaming until the birds outside the east window began at first light. Across the hall in the rooms he had taken for himself 18 months ago, Nathaniel Ashford lay awake. He was not thinking about the ledger. He did not know about the ledger. He was thinking about the look on Abigail's face when she had spoken at the supper, that calm, unshakable steadiness, and trying to identify why it unsettled him more than tears or shouting would have done. He could not identify it. He was not in the end a man who was good at reading the things that truly mattered. He was good at wanting, and at believing that wanting was the same as deserving, and at mistaking a woman's patience for the absence of a plan. He told himself the morning would look better. He told himself Abigail would come to him, or he would go to her, and they would speak plainly, and he would explain that Clara was important to him, had always been important to him. And Abigail was a sensible woman, a banker's daughter. She would understand arrangements. She would see the reasonableness of it. He had been telling himself variations of this for 18 months. The morning did not look better. Abigail came to breakfast before him, ate alone, and left a note on the sideboard, informing Mrs. Patton that she would be traveling to Philadelphia within the week for family business of an indefinite duration. The note said nothing about when she intended to return. It did not say she was leaving permanently. It said she was going to Philadelphia. It was the kind of note that could be read a great many ways. Nathaniel read it, and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, but the particular unease of a man who has been playing a game and has just glimpsed the possibility that the other player has been playing a different game entirely. One with rules he did not know on a board considerably larger than the one he could see. He told himself it was nothing. He poured his coffee. Clara came down at 9:30 in the pale morning wrapper. She had apparently decided suited the East Wing well enough, asked Mrs. Patton whether the mushrooms could be done differently, and sat at the breakfast table as though she had been sitting at it for years. Nathaniel watched her. He thought of Abigail's voice at the supper, flat and clean, carrying without effort. That pearl was paid for by my father's bank, like this house, like your horses, like the supper these people are eating. The mushrooms are fine, he told Mrs. Patton because Clara was waiting for him to say something and he could not think of anything else. Mrs. Patton looked at him, just for a moment, and then she looked away, and her face returned to the careful blankness of a woman who had worked in a house for 11 years and knew which way the weather was turning. Nathaniel drank his coffee and did not taste it. Outside, the summer morning was warm and still, the fields running green and gold to the tree line. The tobacco rows standing straight. The whole estate looking exactly as it had always looked. Prosperous, rooted, enduring. He did not know that the roots had already been loosened. He would not know, not for some time yet. The knowing would come slowly, the way the cold comes first at the edges, then deeper, then finally at the center where you thought you were safe. But this morning, he did not know. He only knew that Abigail's chair was empty at the far end of the table, and the house felt for the first time he could remember like a house that was waiting for something. Abigail left Ashford Hall on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the harvest supper with one trunk, her locked ledger, and the kind of silence that does not ask for acknowledgement. She did not say goodbye to Nathaniel. She had nothing left to say to him that required his face in front of her. Everything she needed to say from this point forward would be said through documents, through numbers, through the quiet and absolute language of money, which was as her father had always told her. The only language that proud men consistently failed to learn until it was reading their own obituary back to them. Mrs. Patton stood at the side door when the carriage came around. She held her apron in both hands and did not try to make her face do anything other than what it was doing, which was the face of a woman who had served in this house for 11 years and was watching the only person in it who deserved her loyalty drive away. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "keep the household accounts separate from the estate accounts," Abigail said from the carriage step. "If anyone attempts to combine them, write to me in Philadelphia. Mr. Mercer will have the address." Mrs. Patton nodded once sharply, the way a soldier nods when given an order they consider both correct and overdue. The carriage moved down the gravel drive. Abigail did not look back at the house. Not because she was not tempted to, she was, but because she had learned early and well that looking back at something you are leaving is only useful if you have not yet finished deciding to leave it. She had finished deciding. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, where the morning light came through the tree line in long flat bars, and she let Ashford Hall disappear behind her without ceremony. She arrived in Philadelphia 4 days later. Her father's house on Chestnut Street was large and quiet in the particular way of houses that have always been managed well. No excess, no waste, nothing loud. Everything in its proper place and cared for. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, met her in the front hall before she had finished removing her traveling cloak, which meant he had been watching for the carriage. He was 61 years old, straight-backed, with her same gray eyes and her same habit of going still when he was thinking most carefully. He looked at her face for a moment. Just her face. Reading it the way he had always read things, not for what was on the surface, but for what the surface was resting on. "Elias is in the study," he said. "Good," she said. "Are you hungry?" "After," she said. He nodded and stepped aside and let her go down the hall toward the study, without asking her anything else, because Edmund Whitmore understood that his daughter had not come home to be comforted. She had come home to work. Elias Mercer rose from the chair behind the desk when she came in. He was exactly as she remembered. Compact, careful, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless it chose to. He had a stack of papers on the desk in front of him, organized with the precision of a man who respected the weight of what was in them. "Sit down, Abigail," he said. "We have a considerable amount to discuss." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. "Show me everything." He showed her everything. It took the better part of 3 hours. What Elias had assembled working from the partial records she had sent him, and the additional inquiries he had made through the Philadelphia banking network, was a complete financial portrait of Ashford Hall, and it was not the portrait Nathaniel Ashford believed he was living inside. The estate carried 4 separate outstanding loans, the most recent of which had been taken in Nathaniel's name the previous spring against the tobacco crop, a crop that had already been half committed against an older debt before the ink on the new note was dry. The Richmond merchant account was overdrawn by an amount that would have been embarrassing at half its actual figure. There were 2 notes held by a private lender in Fredericksburg, a man named Silas Garrett, who was, Elias said with the precision of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion not known for patience or generosity. And then there was the townhouse. Elias set the document on the desk in front of her without comment. It was a lease agreement. 18 months. A property in Fredericksburg 2 streets from the courthouse. The name on the lease was Nathaniel Ashford's. The monthly payments had been drawn from the Ashford Hall estate account under miscellaneous property expenses, which was either extraordinarily careless or extraordinarily confident, and Abigail suspected it was both. "He's been paying her rent," Abigail said. "Not a question." "And her dressmaker," Elias said. "And a livery account. And what appears to be a running account at a milliner's shop on the main street." He paused. "Your guarantee on the estate's primary banking line has been the only thing preventing Garrett from calling the notes." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "How long before he calls them without the guarantee? If you withdraw it today, he will likely move within 60 days, possibly sooner. He is not a patient man, and he is aware that the harvest return will not cover what is owed." She looked at the lease agreement on the desk, at Nathaniel's handwriting on the signature line, at the date. The date was 6 weeks after their wedding. She had been married to him for 6 weeks when he signed the lease on a house for Clara Bellamy in Fredericksburg. She had been planning their first Christmas together. She had been writing letters to her mother about what kind of curtains suited the front parlor. She had been 25 years old and trying very earnestly to build something honest inside a marriage to a man who had already decided, before the ink on their own certificate was dry, that he intended to keep 2 lives running simultaneously and see how long it took her to notice. She set the document back on the desk. "I want to withdraw the guarantee," she said, "and I want to do it in writing formally so that there is no ambiguity about when it was withdrawn and by whom. That will accelerate his exposure considerably." "Yes," she said, "it will." Elias looked at her for a moment. "There is a second option, a more complete option." "Tell me." "Garrett is not the only one holding Ashford notes," Elias said. "The Richmond merchant has been trying to offload the overdrawn account for 3 months. There are 2 smaller creditors in Fredericksburg who would sell at a discount. And Garrett himself." Elias paused with the particular pause of a man who is about to say something that should be said carefully. "Garrett has his own debts. He has been looking for liquidity. If the right buyer approached him privately and offered him a clean settlement in exchange for the full transfer of the Ashford notes..." Abigail looked at him. "I could own the debt," she said. "Through a private trust," Elias said. "Your name would not appear, not initially. The trust would be established through a Philadelphia banking instrument. Completely legal, completely standard, and entirely invisible to anyone in Virginia who was not looking for it." The room was very quiet. Outside the study window, Chestnut Street moved past, in its ordinary afternoon way, carriages, foot traffic, the calls of vendors 2 blocks over. The sounds of a city that worked, that built things, that understood money as a tool rather than an inheritance. "How long would it take," she said, "to acquire all the notes?" 3 months, perhaps 4. Quietly, so as not to alert anyone. "These things require patience." "I have patience," Abigail said. Elias almost smiled. It was a very small almost. "Yes," he said. "I am aware." She stood and smoothed her skirt, and picked up the lease agreement from the desk and looked at it one more time. Nathaniel's handwriting, the date, the address of a house she had never seen, but had been paying for, without knowing it, for 18 months. "Begin," she said, and set it back down. While Elias began, Abigail wrote letters. She wrote to every merchant in Richmond and Fredericksburg, with whom Ashford Hall held an account, informing them politely, formally, in the careful language of a banker's daughter, who knew exactly what she was doing, that she was no longer acting as personal guarantor for purchases made on the Ashford Hall estate account. The letters were brief. They were clear. They used words like effective immediately, and personal liability, and prior authorization required, which were not dramatic words, but were words that made merchants sit down and read them twice. She wrote to the feed merchant who had been paid twice. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply noted the discrepancy, provided the dates and amounts, and expressed confidence that it was an error that would be corrected promptly. It was not an error. She knew it was not an error. The feed merchant knew she knew. He returned the overpayment within a week. She wrote to the fabric supplier in Fredericksburg, who had been billing the Ashford estate account for dresses cut to Clara Bellamy's measurements, and told them the account was closed for personal purchases not authorized by the estate mistress, and that any future bills of that nature would be disputed and referred to her attorney. The fabric supplier did not write back. They did send a revised bill, however, addressed to Nathaniel Ashford personally, without the estate account notation. Nathaniel received it at Ashford Hall on a Thursday morning and stood in the front hallway, holding it for a long time, his face doing something complicated that Mrs. Patton observed from the kitchen doorway, and later described to her sister as the face of a man who has just opened a door he expected to lead to a garden, and found it leading to a much smaller room than he remembered. He wrote to Abigail that afternoon. The letter was 2 pages. It covered in order the suggestion that she had overreacted at the supper, the argument that Clara was an old friend, and nothing more serious than that the assertion that the household accounts were estate business, and she had no right to interfere with them from Philadelphia. And in the final paragraph, which began with the word "furthermore," and descended rapidly from there, the statement that she was his wife, and her place was at Ashford Hall, and he expected her to return within the fortnight. Abigail read the letter once carefully from start to finish. Then she set it on the desk in her father's study, picked up her pen, and wrote back. Her letter was 1 paragraph. It said she had received his correspondence. She noted his views. She was engaged in family business of an indefinite duration, and any matters relating to estate accounts or financial obligations should be directed to Mr. Elias Mercer, whose address in Philadelphia she was enclosing. She did not address the part about her place. She did not address the part about overreacting. She did not address Clara. She signed it with her full name, Abigail Whitmore Ashford, in the handwriting her father had made her practice, until it was straight and clear, and carried no question about who had written it. She sealed it and sent it. Nathaniel, when he received it, read it 3 times. He showed it to Clara that evening, which was either a sign of trust or a sign that he needed someone to tell him it was not as bad as it looked. "She'll come back," Clara said, examining her nails with the ease of a woman who has spent 2 years being confident. "She has nowhere else to go." Nathaniel said nothing, because somewhere very quietly in the part of him that had not yet been entirely consumed by what he wanted instead of what was true, he understood that this was incorrect. Abigail Whitmore Ashford had a great deal of places to go. She had Philadelphia. She had her father's house. She had her father's bank. She had Elias Mercer and 20 years of accumulated trust in the Philadelphia financial community, and a mind that ran numbers the way some people breathed without effort, without interruption, without ever making an error. What she did not have was any reason left to come back. He poured himself a drink and did not say any of this aloud. Back in Philadelphia, the work continued. By October, Elias had quietly acquired the smallest of the Ashford notes, a short-term loan from a Fredericksburg dry goods merchant, who had been trying to recover the money for 14 months, and was relieved enough to sell it at a 15% discount without asking many questions. The trust took the note. The trust had a name that meant nothing, a string of initials that sounded like a minor commercial partnership, and appeared in no document connected to either Whitmore or Mercer. In November, the Richmond Merchant's overdrawn account was purchased. That negotiation was slightly more complicated and required Elias to travel to Richmond in person and spend an afternoon in a back office, being very calm and very reasonable and very specific about what he was offering and why it was better than the alternative. He returned to Philadelphia and told Abigail the account had transferred. "Garrett," Abigail said. "What is he saying?" "He has heard that Ashford Hall is having difficulties," Elias said. "He is being watched by his own creditors. I believe he would settle if someone offered him a clean number." "What number?" Elias told her. She looked at the figure for a moment. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, a very significant number, significant enough that it represented a material portion of the reserve her father had established for her the year she was born. The reserve that had been sitting in a Philadelphia vault, earning modest interest for 27 years waiting for her to need it. She needed it. "Make the offer," she said. "Abigail," her father said from the doorway. He had the quiet habit of appearing in doorways when important things were being decided, not to interfere, but to be present. "That is a large sum." "It is," she agreed. "It will be worth considerably more when it is secured against a working estate in Virginia." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He had the same gray eyes, the same stillness when thinking. "Elias," he said, "make the offer." Elias made the offer. Garrett accepted within 10 days. He was, as Elias had predicted, not a patient man, but he was a practical one, and a clean settlement in cash, from a reputable trust, was considerably better than chasing Nathaniel Ashford through the Virginia courts for the next 2 years. The Garrett notes transferred to the trust in the 3rd week of November. Abigail sat with the completed file that evening, all of it, every note, every account, every debt organized and totaled in Elias's careful hand, and she went through the numbers one final time. Ashford Hall's total outstanding debt as of that evening was held almost entirely by a private trust whose beneficial owner was Abigail Whitmore Ashford. Her husband owed her. Completely. Without knowing it, she thought about the morning she had left Ashford Hall and Mrs. Patton's face at the side door, and the long drive through the Virginia morning with the fields running gold on both sides of the road. She thought about the 60 people at the harvest supper who had watched her husband walk in with another woman wearing her pearls. She thought about the date on the lease agreement 6 weeks after the wedding, 6 weeks while she had been writing to her mother about curtains. She did not feel satisfaction. Not quite yet. Satisfaction was a thing she would allow herself later when the final step was complete. For now, she felt only the clean, focused clarity of a woman who has been patient for a very long time, and can see at last the exact shape of what the patience was for. Meanwhile, at Ashford Hall, the autumn turned cold and things began quietly to come apart. The first sign was the feed merchant who had been supplying the estate's horses and livestock for 4 years, who sent a man out in early October to inform the estate manager politely, but without room for negotiation, that he required payment in full before the next delivery could go out. The estate manager, a thin, worried man named Hobbs, who had been trying to balance the Ashford books through sheer anxiety for the better part of 2 years, went to Nathaniel with the news. Nathaniel told him to send the payment from the estate account. Hobbs told him the estate account did not have the funds. Nathaniel told him to draw on the household reserve. Hobbs told him the household reserve had been separated per Mrs. Ashford's instructions before her departure and was not accessible for estate expenditures. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. "Mrs. Ashford is in Philadelphia." "Yes, sir," Hobbs said. "She gave the instructions before she left, in writing." Nathaniel told him to find the money somewhere. Hobbs went away and found the money somewhere. He borrowed it from a neighbor estate at modest interest, which was itself a small humiliation for a man who considered himself Virginia's most presentable heir. And the feed merchant was paid, and the crisis passed. But it did not stop being a crisis. Clara, who had been living in the East Wing since September, with the full confidence of a woman who expected the logistics of her situation to sort themselves out, began to notice things. The linens were not being replaced as often. Mrs. Patton had become extremely efficient at not hearing requests that came from the East Wing. The household staff moved around Clara with the precise practiced invisibility of people who had made a collective decision about where their loyalty resided and were implementing it without discussion. "Your staff is insolent," Clara told Nathaniel one evening. "They're fine," he said. "They don't listen to me." "They're used to Abigail's direction," he said, which was either an explanation or, without his intending it, an admission, and neither interpretation was comfortable. Clara looked at him. "When is she coming back?" "She'll come back," he said, but he had stopped saying it with the same certainty. The certainty had been eroding for weeks, the way a riverbank erodes, not dramatically, not all at once, but grain by grain quietly. Until one morning, you look and there is considerably less of it than you remember. In December, another merchant's bill arrived. Then another. The note on the Richmond account, the one he had not yet realized had been transferred to an entity he had never heard of, came due for its quarterly payment. Hobbs by this point was sleeping poorly and had developed the particular gauntness of a man being eaten alive by numbers he had no way to make add up. "We need Mrs. Ashford's guarantee reinstated," Hobbs told Nathaniel. "Several of the creditors have written to ask." "I'll handle it," Nathaniel said. He wrote to Abigail again. This letter was shorter than the first and considerably less confident in its tone. He mentioned the accounts. He mentioned the merchants. He used the word reasonable 4 times, which was a reliable sign that he was not feeling reasonable at all, but wanted very much to appear that he was. Abigail's reply came back through Elias Mercer's office. It was brief. It confirmed that she had received his correspondence. It noted without elaboration that her financial guarantee on the Ashford estate accounts had been formally withdrawn as of October 1st. It directed any questions regarding outstanding obligations to Mr. Mercer in Philadelphia. It was signed again in her full name, in her straight, clear handwriting. Nathaniel read it standing at the window of the front parlor on a gray December afternoon. Outside, the fields were bare. The tobacco had been harvested, not well, not as much as the year before, because the year before, Abigail had been managing the planting schedule, and this year no one had thought to ask whether there was a system to it, until it was too late to implement one. The tree line stood dark at the edge of the property. The sky was the color of old pewter. "What does it say?" Clara asked from behind him. He folded the letter. "It says," he said slowly, with the expression of a man arriving at an understanding he had been avoiding for quite some time, "that she has redirected everything to her lawyer." Clara was quiet for a moment. "How much trouble are you in?" He turned from the window. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he had not looked at her in months, without the warm, distorting light of wanting overlaid on everything. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. She was 25 years old and wearing a dress that had been paid for by a bankrupt estate's accounts, and she was asking him how much trouble he was in with an expression that was not. He noticed an expression of someone who had decided to face the trouble alongside him. It was the expression of a woman taking inventory. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." He sent for Hobbs that evening and spent 3 hours going through every account, every note, every outstanding bill. Hobbs had the haunted look of a man who has been carrying bad news for a long time and is relieved in the way of people nearing total collapse to finally be allowed to put it down. By the time they finished, the candles had burned low, and Nathaniel was sitting very still at the table with the accounts spread in front of him, and the full weight of 2 years of carelessness and willful inattention settled across his shoulders like a coat made of iron. The numbers were not good. The numbers were in fact exactly what Abigail had known they were for over a year. She had known the shape of this long before he did. She had been watching it, recording it, understanding it, building a plan around it. And he had been walking through the house she kept solvent and telling himself that the roof above his head was his by right of birth. It was not. It had never been. It had. It had been his by the grace of a woman. He had walked into a harvest supper with another woman's pearls, and the grace, as he was beginning to understand, had been conditional. He sat at the table for a long time after Hobbs went to bed. Then he went to the east wing and knocked on the door. Clara opened it with the slightly wary look of a woman who had been expecting something and was not certain whether what had arrived was the version she preferred. "I need to know something," Nathaniel said. He stood in the doorway. He did not come in. "If the estate cannot be recovered if everything I've told you about what I have turns out to be considerably less than what I said." "Nathaniel," she said, beginning to smile, reaching for lightness, the way she always reached for lightness when things grew heavy. "Answer me," he said. "I need you to answer me honestly." She looked at him. The smile did not make it all the way to her face. She did not answer him. She did not answer him, and that was in its way the only answer that mattered, and they both knew it. And the silence between them in the doorway of the East Wing bedroom on that December night was louder than anything either of them had said all year. He went back to his own rooms. He did not sleep. In Philadelphia, Abigail slept well. She had learned in these months that sleep was not a luxury. It was a discipline, and she intended to keep herself disciplined. There was still work to do. The final note had transferred. The papers were being drawn. The last step was still ahead of her, and it was the most important one, and she meant to be rested and clear-eyed when she took it. She had sent a letter to Richmond the previous week. Not to Nathaniel. Not to any creditor. To the law office of Thomas Carver, who handled civil proceedings in the county seat, and who had at Elias's recommendation agreed to arrange a formal meeting for the early spring. The letter had asked Mr. Carver to send word to Mr. Nathaniel Ashford of Ashford Hall that he was required to appear at the office to discuss the settlement of outstanding obligations held by a private trust. It had not said whose trust. It had not said who would be waiting at the head of the table. It had said only that attendance was required, that the matter was urgent, and that Mr. Ashford's financial future depended entirely on what he decided to do when he arrived. The letter from Thomas Carver's office arrived at Ashford Hall on the second Monday of January 1817, and Nathaniel was at breakfast when Hobbs brought it in. The envelope was plain sealed with the stamp of a Richmond law office, addressed in the formal hand of a clerk who had written many such letters and felt nothing particular about any of them. Nathaniel opened it at the table, which was something he would not have done a year ago. A year ago he would have taken correspondence to his study, because a year ago he had still been performing the role of a man in full command of his affairs. That performance had become expensive to maintain. He read the letter once, then he read it again. "What is it?" Clara asked from across the table. "A law office in Richmond," he said. "They want me to appear in the spring. Something about a private trust holding my outstanding notes." Clara set down her fork. "Which trust?" "I don't know," he said. "I've never heard of it." She looked at him steadily. "Nathaniel, which notes?" He looked up from the paper. In the month since the harvest supper, Clara had undergone a slow and not particularly flattering transformation. The easy confidence she had worn like a second skin since September had begun to thin at the edges, the way cheap fabric thins, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. She was still beautiful. She had always been beautiful. But beauty, Nathaniel was learning at considerable personal expense, was a great deal less useful than he had previously estimated when the feed merchant wanted payment and the household linens needed replacing, and Mrs. Patton looked straight through you in the hallway. "All of them," he said. "Apparently." The silence that followed was the kind that does not invite conversation. He put the letter in his coat pocket and finished his coffee without tasting it, and he told himself, as he had been telling himself for 3 months, that he would sort it out. He was an Ashford. He had the name, the house, the land. These things could be managed. He would go to Richmond. He would speak to the trust's representative. He would arrange terms. Men of his standing arranged terms. That was what men of his standing did. He did not allow himself to think too carefully about the fact that men of his standing in his experience had mostly arranged those terms because there had been a Whitmore guarantee attached to their accounts, and the Whitmore guarantee was no longer attached to anything that bore his name. January moved into February. The social invitations slowed and then stopped. This was the thing that struck him first. Not the creditor letters which had been arriving with increasing frequency since October, and which he had become skilled at putting in a drawer, but the invitations. The Dunhams had their midwinter supper, and Nathaniel's name was not on the guest list. Judge Calloway's wife, who had always greeted him with the particular warmth reserved for heirs of established families, passed him on the road to town without stopping the carriage. Colonel Finch, who had said Nathaniel's father's name loudly at every social occasion for 20 years, had apparently found he could not recall that name with the same ease when there was no supper being laid by a Whitmore to attend it. "They're cutting us," Clara said one evening with the directness of a woman who grew up outside the social circle she was now being excluded from and therefore had less to lose by naming the thing plainly. "They're busy," Nathaniel said. Nathaniel. "They're busy," he said again, with the firmness of a man who has decided that the word busy can carry a great deal more weight than it was designed for. Clara looked at him, and then she looked away, and her expression was the expression of a woman making calculations, not emotional ones. Not the warm, messy calculations of a person who loves someone and is deciding whether to stay, but the clean numerical calculations of a person who is looking at a situation and deciding whether it is still worth what it is costing. Nathaniel did not see the expression. He was looking at the fireplace. February moved into March, and with March came the announcement. Nathaniel made it himself over dinner with the determined brightness of a man who has decided that the best response to a deteriorating situation is a bold public gesture. He would host a ball. A winter ball. Well, a late winter ball. March was not truly winter, but the name had a grandeur to it that suited his intentions. He would open Ashford Hall, hire musicians, order food from Richmond, invite every family in the county, and demonstrate in the clearest possible terms that Ashford Hall was still the center of Virginia social life and that he was still its master. Clara brightened at the announcement. The prospect of a ball was the first thing that had animated her face in weeks, in a way that looked like genuine pleasure rather than performance. She talked about the menu and the decorations and what she would wear and who would be invited, and for one evening, the East Wing had a warmth to it that had been missing since December. Hobbs came to Nathaniel the next morning with his hat in his hands and his face the color of old ash. "Sir," he said, "the expense of a ball of that scale?" "Handle it," Nathaniel said. "Sir, I have run the figures and the estate account." "Handle it," Nathaniel said again. "We will send to Richmond. Put it on account." "Sir," Hobbs said with the careful precision of a man who has been asked to say something that may end badly for him. "The Richmond accounts are not. Several of the merchants have indicated they require payment before extending further credit. Since Mrs. Ashford withdrew." "I know what Mrs. Ashford withdrew," Nathaniel said sharply. Hobbs stood very still. "Send to Fredericksburg," Nathaniel said. "There is a merchant on the main street who has done business with us before. He has written 3 times in the last 2 months, Hobbs said quietly. "The letters are in the drawer, sir, where you put them." The letters in the drawer. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "Find a way," he said. Hobbs found a way, the way desperate men always find a way, by borrowing against the next thing, and then the thing after that, and each solution containing within it the seed of the next problem, the whole structure growing more precarious with each additional weight placed on it. The invitations went out in mid-March. The responses came back slowly, then more slowly, then barely at all. Nathaniel told himself people were delayed in their replies. He told Clara the families were simply slower to confirm this time of year. Clara agreed brightly with the practiced enthusiasm of a woman who had learned that agreeing brightly was the path of least resistance, though her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, did something else entirely. The evening of the ball arrived on a Thursday in late March, when the last cold of the season was still in the air, and the candles in Ashford Hall's main rooms were lit by 6 o'clock in anticipation. The musicians arrived. They tuned their instruments in the corner of the ballroom and waited. The food was laid. The candles burned. 7 o'clock came. No one arrived. Nathaniel stood at the far end of the ballroom in his best coat and watched the door. Clara stood beside him, in a new gown paid for, though neither of them said so, from the last usable line of the estate's personal account, and watched the door with him. The musicians played a slow introductory piece, because that was what they had been hired to do, and they were professionals, and they would continue doing it until told otherwise. 7:30. "They're late," Clara said. Nathaniel said nothing. 8 o'clock. One carriage came up the drive. Nathaniel's posture changed. Shoulders, lifted jaw set with the particular relief of a man who has been holding his breath and is finally allowed to stop. The carriage door opened. It was Samuel Crane. Samuel Crane was 44 years old, a land speculator from the northern part of the county. A man with a wide smile and very small eyes, and the kind of aggressive social confidence that comes from having money in an era when having money excused a great many other deficiencies. He had not been invited to the ball, or rather, he had been invited along with everyone else in the county. But he was not among the families Nathaniel had been counting on to anchor the evening. He came in with his hat under his arm and looked around the empty ballroom with an expression that was not quite surprise and was considerably closer to satisfaction. "Ashford," he said, extending his hand. "Quite an occasion." "Crane," Nathaniel said, taking the hand. "You're early." "Am I?" Crane said pleasantly, looking around at the empty room, the untouched food, the musicians playing to no one. "I don't believe I am." He turned his attention to Clara, then, with the full deliberate attention of a man who has assessed a room in 30 seconds and identified the only interesting thing in it, he took her hand and bowed over it with considerably more warmth than was strictly required. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "We haven't," Clara said, and she smiled at him, the real smile, the warm one, the one that Nathaniel had not seen directed at himself in several weeks. Nathaniel watched this exchange from a distance of 4 feet. 8:30 came and went. The Merriweathers did not come. The Dunhams did not come. Judge Calloway and his wife did not come. Colonel Finch did not come. The families who had eaten Abigail's food and drunk Abigail's wine and complimented Abigail on the quality of her household management for 3 years did not come to Nathaniel Ashford's ball, because the county of Virginia had made its decision sometime between October and March, quietly and collectively, in the way that social communities make decisions, not by meeting and voting, but by each individual household looking at the situation and arriving at the same conclusion independently. The conclusion was Abigail Whitmore was a Whitmore. Nathaniel Ashford had chosen to make her his enemy, which was his business, but they were not going to sit at his table while he did it. In the corner, the musicians kept playing. They had been paid in advance. Hobbs, to his credit, had insisted on that, and they were not going to stop until the clock said they should. The food sat untouched on the long table. The candles burned lower. Nathaniel stood in the middle of his empty ballroom and felt for the first time in his life the specific and irreversible sensation of understanding something too late. Not the financial ruin he had been dimly aware of, the financial ruin for months approaching it, the way you approach a bad dream, knowing it is there, hoping that something will change before you reach it. Not even the social abandonment, which he had been telling himself was temporary and correctable. What he felt now was the understanding of what Abigail had meant at the harvest supper when she had stood 3 feet in front of him and said that Pearl was paid for by my father's bank. Like this house, like your horses, like the supper these people are eating. She had not been making an argument. She had not been fighting for her dignity, though she had kept it entirely. She had been telling him the truth, plainly, in front of everyone. She had told him the truth, and he had chosen in front of 60 witnesses not to hear it. The county had heard it. Across the room, Clara was laughing at something Samuel Crane had said. She tilted her head the particular way she tilted it when she was deploying charm, and Crane was receiving the deployment with the full enthusiasm of a man who had considerably more money than the man standing 20 feet away, and was not unaware of the comparison. Nathaniel watched them. He felt the cold of the room more than he had an hour ago. "Nathaniel!" Clara's voice from across the room. She was still smiling. Crane was still beside her. "Samuel was telling me about his property in the northern county. He says the land is remarkable." "Is it?" Nathaniel said. 1,200 acres, Crane said, with the pleasant ease of a man who mentions his acreage the way other men mention the weather. "Good farmland. I've been looking to expand into the valley." He glanced around the empty ballroom. "I heard Mrs. Ashford has been managing some business from Philadelphia. Your wife is a capable woman." "She is," Nathaniel said. He said it automatically without thinking about it, and the truth of it, the plain, simple, inarguable truth of it, landed in the empty room with the weight of everything it had cost him to learn. "Smart family," Crane said. "The Whitmores. Her father built half of what passes for sound banking in this state." He looked at Nathaniel without particular malice, just the clear-eyed assessment of a man who has made his career by reading situations accurately. "Shame about the estate accounts. Word gets around." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "it does." Crane turned back to Clara with a fresh smile. 9 o'clock arrived. 9:15. The musicians played their final piece at 9:30 and began packing their instruments with the practiced efficiency of people who have seen this kind of evening before and do not intend to comment on it. Hobbs came to the doorway at 10 o'clock and looked at Nathaniel with the face of a man who has nothing left to say and is simply present because someone needs to be. "The kitchen wants to know about the food, sir," he said quietly. Nathaniel looked at the long table, the untouched dishes, the candles burning down to their stubs. "Give it to the workers," he said. Hobbs nodded and went away. Clara and Samuel Crane were still talking in the far corner. Their voices were low now, more private the way voices get when the two people using them have decided that the other people in the room are no longer relevant to the conversation they are actually having. Nathaniel looked at them for a long moment. He thought about the harvest supper. 60 people. Abigail standing 3 feet in front of him, calm as still water, saying things that were true. He thought about the empty ballroom. One guest. The wrong guest. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket from the Richmond law office about a private trust holding his outstanding notes requesting his attendance in the spring. The spring was 6 weeks away. He took the letter out of his pocket and looked at it again, standing in his empty ballroom with the candles guttering and the food going cold. And this time, he read it with the full attention he should have given it the first time, and this time, he noticed something he had missed. The trust had a name. A string of initials. WMT. He had read past it the first time because it meant nothing to him. Strings of initials on legal documents rarely meant anything unless you knew what you were looking for. WMT. Whitmore. Mercer. Trust. He stood very still for a long moment, his eyes on those 3 letters, the candles burning low around him. Clara's voice a murmur from across the room. The musicians gone, the guests who had never arrived somehow more present in their absence than they would have been in their attendance. WMT. He had spent 2 years in a house that Abigail's family money had kept standing, and he had never once thought to ask what would happen to the house if the money stopped standing behind it. He had never once thought that a woman who had grown up in a Philadelphia banking house, who balanced accounts the way other women balanced teacups, who had kept a private ledger locked in her desk for 3 years, he had never once thought that she might have been not merely patient, but planning. He put the letter back in his pocket. Across the room, Clara laughed again. Crane said something about his northern property. Clara's head tilted. "I'd love to see it someday," she said. "I'd be very pleased to arrange that," Crane said. Nathaniel turned and walked out of the ballroom, down the hall, into his study. He closed the door behind him and stood in the dark for a moment, and then he lit the single candle on the desk and sat down and looked at the wall in front of him. He sat there for a long time. There was a knock at the study door after some time had passed. He thought it was Clara. He thought she had come to explain Crane, or to say something reassuring, or to deploy the lightness that she deployed when things got heavy, and he discovered sitting in the dark with the candle burning low that he did not have the patience left for any of those things. He did not want her explanations. He did not want her lightness. He was not sure sitting here in the wreckage of the evening he had staged to prove he did not need Abigail Whitmore what exactly he wanted from Clara Bellamy, but he was beginning to understand at last what he had given up to have it. The knock came again. "Come in," he said. It was Hobbs. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," Hobbs said. "There's something you should know." He held a paper, another letter delivered earlier in the day, and set on the hall table where it had been waiting. From the Fredericksburg lender, the note on the eastern pasture. They've accelerated the call date. By how much? They want settlement by April 1st, Hobbs said. 3 weeks, sir. Nathaniel took the paper. He looked at it. The numbers were clear and specific and entirely without mercy. "Hobbs," he said. "The private trust, the WMT trust. Have you heard of it?" Hobbs was quiet for a fraction too long. "Hobbs?" Nathaniel said again, looking up. The estate manager had the expression of a man who knows something and has been trying to decide for several weeks whether it was his place to say it, and has now been directly asked and has run out of room to decide. "There is a Whitmore Banking Trust in Philadelphia," Hobbs said carefully. "It has been active since the late 1790s. Mr. Edmund Whitmore established it. It operates under several names, I believe, for various instruments." He paused. "I am not a financial man, sir. But when the letter came in January, the initials I thought it might—" "You thought it might be hers," Nathaniel said. Hobbs said nothing. Which was an answer. Nathaniel set the letter from the Fredericksburg lender on the desk beside the one from Richmond and looked at them side by side. W.M.T. Whitmore, Mercer, Trust. She owned his debt, not her father, not a bank, not a faceless creditor in Richmond. Abigail, his wife who had left with one trunk and her locked ledger, and the silence of a woman who did not need to say what she was going to do because she was already doing it. Abigail had spent the last 5 months purchasing every note, every obligation, every claim against Ashford Hall, and folding them quietly into a trust that bore no name anyone in Virginia would recognize, and she had done it so cleanly and so completely that he had not seen it until he was standing in the ruin of his own empty ballroom with the candles burning out. She did not need revenge. He understood that now with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped looking away from something. She did not need to shout or cry or expose him publicly. She did not need the sympathy of the county, though she had it. She did not need him to understand what he had done, though sitting here he was beginning to. She needed none of those things because she had done something considerably more complete. She had waited. She had watched. She had made her father's bank and Elias Mercer and 3 years of careful knowledge about exactly how Ashford Hall functioned and exactly where every debt was held and exactly what every creditor wanted. She had made all of it into a single instrument, quiet and invisible, and she had aimed it at him with the precision of a woman who had been a banker's daughter before she was ever a man's wife. And in the spring, she was waiting at the head of the table in Richmond. Outside the study window, a carriage crunched on the gravel drive. He did not need to look to know whose it was. Samuel Crane, taking his leave. And from the east wing of the house for the first time all evening, no sound at all. The morning Nathaniel Ashford rode to Richmond, he told no one where he was going. Not Clara, who had been sleeping later and later each morning and spending her afternoons in the east wing with a quietness that had replaced her earlier confidence, the way frost replaces warmth, gradually, completely, without announcement. Not Hobbs, who had enough to worry about with the feed merchant's latest letter and the eastern pasture note that was now 11 days from its accelerated call date. Not Mrs. Patton, who would have known from his face that something significant was happening, and who had, in Nathaniel's estimation, been reporting to Philadelphia since October. He told himself he was going to negotiate. He told himself he was going to walk into Thomas Carver's law office and sit across from whatever representative the WMT Trust had sent, and negotiate terms the way a Virginia landowner negotiated terms from a position of dignity with the full weight of the Ashford name behind him, and arrive at an arrangement that allowed him to keep his house and his land, and whatever remained of the life he had built. He had been telling himself this for 6 weeks since the night of the empty ballroom, and he had become reasonably skilled at believing it for stretches of several hours at a time. The road to Richmond was cold and clear. He rode rather than took the carriage, partly because the carriage required a driver, and he did not want a witness to this journey, and partly because riding gave him something to do with his body, while his mind ran the conversation. He intended to have the measured opening, the acknowledgement of the difficulties, the proposal of terms, the extension of the Ashford name as collateral against a payment arrangement. It was a reasonable plan. It was the kind of plan that worked when the person across the table wanted something you had. He arrived in Richmond at 10:30 and went directly to Thomas Carver's office on the main street, a narrow building between a printer and a hat shop, with a brass plate on the door that had been polished recently enough to still carry the morning light. He straightened his coat. He went in. The clerk at the front desk was young, precise, and gave nothing away. He asked Nathaniel's name, confirmed the appointment, and led him down a short hallway to a closed door at the back of the building. "They're expecting you, sir," the clerk said, and opened the door and stepped aside. Nathaniel walked in. The room held a long table. Thomas Carver sat at the near end, a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s with a lawyer's practiced neutrality arranged across his features. Elias Mercer sat to his right with a stack of documents in front of him, organized with the precision of a man who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. And at the head of the table, in the chair that Nathaniel had been imagining occupied by a bank representative, or a trust officer, or any one of several impersonal financial figures his mind had been constructing for 6 weeks, Abigail. She was dressed in dark blue wool, her hair pinned back simply, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She looked exactly as she had looked standing 3 feet from him at the harvest supper, completely still, completely present, not a single thing about her suggesting she was anything other than exactly where she intended to be. Nathaniel stopped walking. The door closed behind him. He stood at the far end of the table and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And the silence between them was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people for whom everything has already been said, and what remains is only the accounting. "Sit down, Nathaniel," Abigail said. Her voice was the same, calm, carrying without effort. He sat down. For a moment he could not organize words into any order that seemed adequate. He had prepared for a negotiation. He had not prepared for her. He had spent 6 weeks building a composure for the wrong room. "You own it," he said finally. "Not a question. The WMT trust, the notes, the mortgages, the merchant accounts, all of it." "Yes," she said. "All of it. All of it." He looked at Elias Mercer, who looked back at him with the expression of a man who has no particular animosity toward Nathaniel Ashford, and no particular sympathy either, and who is here to perform a function and will perform it with complete thoroughness. "How long?" Nathaniel asked. "I began in October," Abigail said. The last note transferred in November, October, while he had been telling Clara that Abigail would come back, while he had been putting letters in the drawer, while he had been planning the winter ball with the certainty of a man who still believed his name was worth something independent of what she had been quietly doing with her family's money. "I didn't know," he said. He said it not as an excuse, but as a fact, and the fact landed with the particular weight of a thing that is true and useless simultaneously. "No," she said. "You didn't." Thomas Carver cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, if I may, the purpose of this meeting is to present you with the full accounting of the obligations currently held by the WMT Trust, and to discuss the options available to you at this time." He slid a document down the table. Nathaniel picked it up. The numbers were precise, complete, and merciless. Every note, every mortgage, every overdrawn account, the Fredericksburg townhouse lease. It was all there, totaled at the bottom, in Elias Mercer's careful hand, and the total was a figure that sat on the page like a stone. Nathaniel set the document down. "What are the options?" he said. Carver looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Nathaniel. "There are two," she said. "The first, you sign Ashford Hall and its estate over to me legally, in full, clear of any further claim by you or your family. In exchange, you receive a modest annual allowance enough to live on comfortably if you live simply and your debts are considered settled. You leave Virginia." The words fell into the room cleanly, without drama, without cruelty. She said them the way her father had taught her to say things that needed to be said plainly, without embellishment, giving the other person the full dignity of understanding exactly what was in front of them. Nathaniel looked at the table. "And the second option," he said. "I call the notes," she said. "All of them, simultaneously. You go through public bankruptcy proceedings in the Virginia courts. Your name, your father's name, the estate, all of it becomes part of the public record of a man who borrowed more than he could repay and chose a mistress over the woman who was keeping him solvent." She paused. "The county already knows most of it. The courts would simply make it official." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at them, at his own hands, which were the hands of a man who had inherited a great deal and built very little, and which were now being asked to sign away the thing the inheritance had given him. "The allowance," he said. "How much?" Elias told him the figure. It was not a generous figure. It was not intended to be generous. It was intended to be sufficient, the difference between poverty and survival, offered not out of warmth, but out of the particular brand of practical mercy that does not require the recipient to be grateful, only to be gone. "You'd let me walk away," Nathaniel said. He looked up at Abigail. "After everything, you'd just let me walk away." "I'd require you to walk away," she said. "That is not the same thing." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man who has been disarmed so completely that there is nothing left to do but acknowledge it. "You planned this from the beginning, from the morning after the supper." "I planned it from considerably before the supper," she said quietly. "The supper was when I decided to stop waiting to see if planning would be necessary." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Guilt had been available to him for 2 years, and he had consistently chosen not to feel it. This was different. This was the specific and devastating expression of a man who is understanding all at once the full weight of what he had in his hands and how he held it and what his holding it that way had cost. "Abigail," he said. Her name, just her name, said in a voice that had nothing left in it to perform. She looked at him steadily. "The workers," he said. "Hobbs, Mrs. Patton, the tenant families on the eastern pasture. What happens to them?" It was the first question he had asked about anyone other than himself. She noted this. She did not say she noted it, but something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration, the way a scale recalibrates when a true weight is finally placed on it. "They stay," she said. "Every one of them. The estate continues operating. I have plans for the land that will employ more workers than it currently does, not fewer." She held his gaze. "I am not doing this to destroy Ashford Hall, Nathaniel. I am doing this to take it from the person who was destroying it and give it to someone who will not." He was quiet for a long moment. "She's going to leave," he said then, meaning Clara, not looking for sympathy or confirmation, just saying a thing he had known since the night Samuel Crane had stood in his empty ballroom, and Clara had tilted her head the way she tilted it when she was deploying charm at a richer man. "Yes," Abigail said. "She is." "She already has, hasn't she?" Abigail said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He had known since March. He had known and not said so, the way he had known many things over the past 2 years, and not said so, filing them in the drawer with the letters he didn't want to read. Clara had been spending more afternoons in town since February. She had been vague about where. She had stopped asking about the estate accounts, which was not the behavior of a woman who had made her peace with the situation, but the behavior of a woman who had already decided that the situation was no longer hers to make peace with. The week before his ride to Richmond, he had come back from the fields to find the East Wing empty. Not temporarily empty, the kind of empty that has been prepared where certain items are missing, and the remaining ones are arranged with the care of someone who intended the arrangement to be final. She had left a note. It was brief and not unkind, briefer and not unkinder than he deserved. She said she was sorry. She said she wished him well. She did not say where she was going, but the northern county was not a long ride, and Samuel Crane had 1,200 acres of good farmland, and no current entanglement, and Clara Bellamy had always been practical about the things that mattered. He had put the note in the drawer. Now he sat at the head of a Richmond law table, and looked at his wife across the distance of everything that had happened between them, and understood in the full and irreversible way that some understandings arrive not gradually, not mercifully, but all at once complete, that he had never deserved her. Not once. Not from the beginning. He had married her money and told himself he was marrying her. He had borrowed against her guarantee and told himself it was his own credit. He had stood in her house at her supper and handed another woman her pearl necklace and told himself that Abigail was strong enough to withstand it, as though her strength were something he was entitled to consume without acknowledging what it cost her to produce. He had been wrong about all of it. Every calculation, every assumption. He had looked at a woman who could read the financial collapse of an estate at 25 paces and file it in a locked ledger and wait with perfect patience until the moment was exactly right, and he had looked at that woman and seen someone manageable. "I'll sign," he said. Elias slid the document across the table. Nathaniel picked up the pen. His hand was not steady. He did not try to make it steady. That performance was finished, and steadiness was not something he had earned the right to perform today. He signed his name where Carver indicated and where Elias indicated, and on the final page, where the transfer of the Ashford Hall estate was made legal and complete, he set the pen down and did not pick it up again. Thomas Carver collected the documents. Elias organized them with his usual precision, checking each signature, each date, each notation, with the thoroughness of a man who knows that the value of a document is entirely in its accuracy. Nathaniel sat back. He felt unexpectedly something that was not entirely the sensation he had anticipated. He had expected devastation. He had expected the particular shame of a man stripped publicly of everything his family name had ever stood for. He felt those things. Yes, they were present, they were real, they would be present and real for a long time. But underneath them, quieter and more unsettling, he felt something else. Relief. The weight he had been carrying. The weight of the accounts in the drawer. The letters he hadn't read. The conversations. He hadn't had the full and elaborate structure of pretending that everything was manageable when it had not been manageable for years. That weight was gone. It had been signed away with his name, and it was gone, and the going of it left him lighter than he had any right to feel. He looked at Abigail. She was speaking quietly with Elias, reviewing something in the final document set. Her profile was composed and certain. She did not look like a woman who had won. She looked like a woman who had finished a job that needed doing. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it without preamble, without the softening language that men use when they want to apologize without fully accepting what they are apologizing for. Just those two words, as plainly as she had always said things to him. "I am sorry. For the supper. For Clara. For the accounts. For all of it. I am sorry." She looked at him for a moment. "Oh, I know you are," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply as a statement of what she believed to be true, offered without either comfort or condemnation, the way she offered most true things. "Does it matter?" he asked. She considered this question with the same seriousness she gave to figures in a ledger, fully without rush. "It matters that you mean it," she said finally. "It doesn't change what needed to happen." He nodded. That was fair. That was more fair than he had earned. "The allowance," he said. "Where should I?" "Elias will send you the arrangements," she said. "There is a coastal town in South Carolina. Small, quiet. The allowance will be comfortable there." She paused. "I would ask that you not return to Virginia. Not because I am afraid of what you might do. Because a clean break is better for everyone, including you." "Including me," he repeated. And then quietly, "You still think about what's good for me." "I think about what's practical," she said. "They are sometimes the same thing." Carver announced that the formalities were concluded and offered coffee, which Nathaniel declined, and Abigail accepted. which struck him as the most perfectly characteristic exchange they had ever had. She was staying. She had work left to do. Here she was going to drink coffee and review documents and make plans. He was leaving, and coffee was not going to help him with any of the things the next several months required. He stood. He straightened his coat, the habit of a man performing dignity in the absence of the substance, and he picked up his hat. At the door he paused. He did not turn around. He could hear Abigail speaking quietly with Elias behind him, already moving forward, already on the next page. "The pearl necklace," he said. "Clara took it when she left." A pause. "I know," Abigail said. "It doesn't matter." "It was your father's," he said. "It was," she agreed. "And my father taught me that things can be replaced. What cannot be replaced is the judgment to understand the value of what you're holding before you let it go." He stood at the door for a moment longer. Then he put on his hat and walked out into the Richmond morning, and the door closed behind him. And Abigail Whitmore Ashford turned back to the documents on the table and picked up her pen and began. Outside his horse was where he had tied it. The street moved past with its ordinary Richmond business carts and voices and the smell of the river 2 blocks over. He untied the horse and stood with the reins in his hands for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about the harvest supper. The candles and the 60 guests and Abigail's voice carrying without effort across the silent room. The pearl at Clara's throat. His own happiness. God help him, his own happiness walking through that door, and the thing he had seen on Abigail's face, that complete and terrible steadiness, which he had read at the time as coldness, and understood now as something entirely different. It had not been coldness. It had been the face of a woman who had already decided. Who had looked at what was in front of her and made her calculation and committed to it with the full and irreversible certainty of someone who does not make calculations lightly and does not unmake them at all. He mounted the horse. The road back to Ashford Hall was the same road he had ridden this morning, the same cold, clear air, the same fields at the edge of the tree line. But Ashford Hall was no longer his, and the road that led to it was no longer a road home. He turned the horse south. Behind him, in a law office on a Richmond side street, Abigail Whitmore was reviewing the deed to an estate that bore her family's investment in every stone and every acre and every debt that had just been settled. Elias was confirming the transfer of accounts. Thomas Carver was sealing documents with the Richmond court seal. And on the table in front of Abigail, beside the completed deed and the organized file of purchased notes, was a small sheet of paper in her own handwriting. Not legal language, not account numbers, but a list. Written months ago in the house on Chestnut Street, on an evening when she had finished the final calculation and allowed herself for the first time to think not about what she was taking back, but about what she intended to build. Tenant cabin repairs, schoolhouse, fair wages for the farm workers, new seed rotation for the southern fields, restoration of the kitchen garden, plans for the eastern pasture. Not revenge, not merely recovery, something better than what had been there before. She picked up her pen and drew a clean line across the top of the list, the way her father had taught her to begin a new ledger page, clearing the old account, opening the new one, starting from the first entry with everything that came before acknowledged and set aside. She wrote a date at the top, April 1817, and then she wrote in her straight, clear handwriting the first line of the new account, Ashford Hall. Owner, Abigail Whitmore. Abigail returned to Ashford Hall on a Thursday morning in late April, 17 days after the Richmond signing, with Elias Mercer beside her in the carriage and a satchel of documents on the seat between them, and no ceremony whatsoever. She had not announced the date of her return. She had not written ahead to prepare anyone. She had simply finished what needed finishing in Philadelphia, the final account transfers, the legal notifications, the letters to the Richmond court confirming the deed, and then she had packed a single trunk, said goodbye to her father in the front hall of the Chestnut Street house, and gotten into the carriage. Her father had held both her hands before she left. He had looked at her face the way he always looked at it, reading the surface, and the thing the surface was resting on. "You know what you're walking into?" he said. It was not a question. "I know exactly what I'm walking into," she said. "That's why I'm ready for it." He squeezed her hands once the way he had always done, firm, brief, the handshake of a man who trusted his daughter completely and was not going to insult that trust by wishing her luck. "Send word when you're settled," he said. "Within the week," she said, and stepped into the carriage. The drive to Virginia took 4 days. She spent them reading, reviewing the plans she had drafted through the winter, going over Elias's recommendations for the estate accounts with the focused attention of someone who is not traveling toward a destination but toward the beginning of a job. She arrived at Ashford Hall on a morning that was warm enough to carry the first real suggestion of spring, the fields showing green at the edges, the tree line beginning to fill in the air, carrying the particular freshness of a season that is done, being winter and means to make something of itself. Hobbs was waiting in the yard when the carriage came up the drive. He was standing straight, hat in hand, with the look of a man who has been surviving rather than living for several months, and is not ashamed of the survival, but is very ready for it to be over. Behind him, 2 of the farm workers had stopped what they were doing and were watching the carriage with the careful attention of people who understand that what happens in the next few minutes matters considerably to their futures. Abigail stepped down before Elias had finished climbing out. "Hobbs," she said. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and then correcting himself with the instinct of a man who reads documents when they concern his livelihood. "Miss Whitmore, ma'am." He stopped. He had the expression of a man who has prepared a speech and lost it entirely upon delivery. "Hobbs," she said, not unkindly. "How are the horses?" He blinked. "They're well, ma'am, mostly. The bay gelding has been favoring his left foreleg since February. I've had the farrier out twice. And the winter feed stock." "We managed," he said with the particular emphasis of a man for whom managing had required considerably more than the word suggested. "It was close, but we managed." "Good," she said. "I need the full accounts on the desk in the study by tomorrow morning. Not the estate ledger, the real one. Every account, every outstanding bill, every arrangement you've made in the last 6 months to keep things running." She looked at him steadily. "You've been holding this together on your own. I know that. I'm not here to audit you. I'm here to take the weight off." Hobbs looked at her for a moment. His jaw moved slightly. The jaw of a man who has been holding a great deal back and is deciding whether it is safe to stop holding it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I'll have it ready." She nodded and went inside. Mrs. Patton was in the hallway. She had not been warned either, but she was there, which meant she had been watching for the carriage, or someone had seen it on the road, and sent word ahead. She stood with her apron in both hands, the same gesture as the morning Abigail had left, and her face was doing something that a less composed woman would have let become crying. Abigail stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Patton," she said, "I owe you 7 months of wages at the rate I promised you before I left, plus what the estate should have paid you since October. Elias has the figure. You'll have it by end of week." Mrs. Patton made a sound. It was a very small sound, and it was immediately suppressed, but it contained within it the accumulated pressure of 7 months of feeding a household that was falling apart around her while staying at her post because someone had to. "The kitchen," Mrs. Patton said, composing herself with visible effort. "I've kept it running. There are some supplies we're short on. I made a list." "Give it to Elias," Abigail said. "He'll arrange the orders today." Mrs. Patton nodded sharply and went back to the kitchen, and if her posture was slightly straighter than it had been in 7 months, no one was going to remark on it. Abigail walked through the house. She walked through it the way she had learned to read a ledger, not looking for what was on the surface, but for what the surface was resting on. The front parlor needed repainting. The main hall runner was worn through in 2 places. The east wing door was closed, and she did not open it. Whatever Clara had left behind in that room could wait until she had addressed everything else, and everything else was considerable. She went to the study and sat at the desk and opened the satchel and began. The first week at Ashford Hall was the hardest and the most necessary week of Abigail Whitmore's life. Not because of grief. She had done her grieving in Philadelphia, in the quiet of her father's house in the evenings after the legal work was finished, and there was nothing left between her and the plain reality of what her marriage had been and was no longer. She had grieved it thoroughly without performance in private, and she had arrived at the place that people arrive at when they grieve something properly. Not the absence of feeling, but the absence of the particular pain that comes from pretending the feeling isn't there. What made that first week hard was the sheer volume of what needed to be done. Hobbs delivered the accounts as promised. She spent 2 full days going through them, and the picture they painted was worse in some places than she had anticipated, and better in others. The horses were in reasonable shape. Hobbs had prioritized them correctly. The main fields had been planted, if not ideally, and the spring growth suggested the harvest would be manageable. The tenant cabins on the eastern pasture were a different matter entirely. She rode out to the eastern pasture on the 3rd day with Hobbs beside her, and the spring morning sharp and clear, and what she found was not the comfortable picture she had carried in her mind of workers maintained in adequate conditions, but a reality that was considerably more uncomfortable than that. 3 of the 6 tenant cabins needed immediate roof repairs. The well serving the eastern cluster had been showing signs of structural weakness since autumn and had been left unaddressed because there was no money to address it. There were 4 families living in conditions that an honest accounting would describe as inadequate, managed by people who had been making do because making do was what you did when the estate master wasn't looking and the estate mistress wasn't there. She sat on her horse and looked at the eastern pasture and felt something that was not guilt exactly. She had not created these conditions. They had existed before she arrived and worsened in her absence, but was adjacent to guilt. The particular weight of a person who has been looking at large numbers for months and is now standing in front of the human reality those numbers represent. "How long has the well been compromised?" she asked Hobbs. "Since September, ma'am. I wrote to Mr. Ashford twice about it." "And?" Hobbs said nothing, which was an answer. "The families, do they have enough to eat?" "They've been managing with their own kitchen gardens mostly. The estate rations have been irregular." She looked at the cabins. Then she looked at Hobbs. "I want a full repair assessment by end of week. Every structure on this property that needs work. Every well, every cabin, every fence line, everything." She paused. "And I want you to go to each of the tenant families this afternoon and tell them personally that the wages and rations that were in arrears will be paid in full by Friday. Not a promise a date, Friday." Hobbs wrote it down. His hand was moving quickly, the hand of a man who has been waiting for someone to give him direction he could actually carry out. "The well first," she added. "Today. Send for a well builder in town. I don't care what it costs." "Yes, ma'am," Hobbs said, and she could hear in those 2 words the full and genuine relief of a man who has been trying to do right by people with his hands tied and whose hands have just been untied. She rode back to the house and wrote 3 letters before noon. The first was to a builder in Richmond about the cabin repairs. The second was to the seed merchant in Fredericksburg, a different merchant than the one who had been overcharging the estate for 2 years. A fact she had noted and acted on about the summer planting rotation she had designed over the winter. The third was to a woman named Margaret Hayes, in the county seat, a schoolteacher who had written to Abigail the previous year about the possibility of establishing a schoolhouse in the area, and received at the time a regretful response about the current constraints on the Ashford Hall estate budget. The constraints were different now. Margaret Hayes wrote back within 4 days. Her letter was 2 pages and vibrated with the particular energy of a person who has been waiting for permission to do something they have been ready to do for a long time. Abigail wrote back she had located a suitable building on the property's south edge that could be converted. She had budgeted the renovation. She would need Margaret's assessment of what materials and furnishings a proper schoolroom required. Could she come out the following Tuesday? Margaret Hayes came out the following Tuesday and stayed for 4 hours and left with a list of requirements and the expression of a woman who has just been given everything she asked for and is processing the novelty of it. The Dunhams heard about the schoolhouse project before it was finished. The news traveled the way news travels in a Virginia county through a series of conversations that were ostensibly about other things, writer to writer, kitchen to kitchen, until Margaret Dunham mentioned it to her husband over supper, and Dunham said, with the quiet certainty of a man revising an earlier position, "I told you she'd do something worth watching." Judge Calloway's wife came to call in early May. She arrived unannounced, which was the kind of visit that meant something. An announced visit was courtesy, an unannounced visit was a statement of intent. Abigail received her in the front parlor, which had been repainted the week before and smelled of fresh whitewash and late spring air coming through the open window. Mrs. Calloway sat down with the composure of a woman who has come to say something and intends to say it. "I want to tell you," she said, "that I regret not coming to call sooner. What happened at the harvest supper was—" She paused, selecting her words with care. "It was not something anyone in this county has forgotten." "I know," Abigail said. "Several of us felt we should have spoken more plainly at the time. You were in a difficult position," Abigail said without bitterness, because she genuinely meant it. "I don't hold anyone accountable for managing a difficult social moment with discretion." Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a moment. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Whitmore." "I am a practical one," Abigail said. "Would you like to see the schoolhouse plans?" Mrs. Calloway looked at the plans for 40 minutes and left, promising that the judge would arrange a formal letter of support to the county authorities for the establishment of a permanent school district. The Merriweathers came the following week. The week after that, Colonel Finch arrived in person for the first time without mentioning Nathaniel's father's name, and spent an hour asking detailed questions about the summer planting rotation, which was either genuine agricultural interest or a very effective form of social penance, and either way was welcome. The county had made its decision again, as quietly and collectively as before, each household arriving at the same conclusion independently, only this time the conclusion was different. Abigail Whitmore was running Ashford Hall. Abigail Whitmore was paying her workers fairly and repairing the tenant cabins and building a schoolhouse and replanting the southern fields with a rotation that anyone who understood farming could see was considerably better managed than anything the estate had done in recent memory. Abigail Whitmore was without announcement or performance doing the work that the name on the estate should have been doing all along. The county intended to be on the right side of that. In June, the cabin repairs were completed. Hobbs stood with Abigail at the edge of the eastern pasture, and they looked at the newly repaired roofs and the repaired well and the kitchen garden that one of the tenant women, a quietly capable person named Ruth Barrow, had expanded considerably once it became clear that expanding it was not only permitted but encouraged. "Mrs. Barrow wants to know if she might sell some of the surplus at the county market," Hobbs said. "She may sell it and keep the profit," Abigail said. Hobbs wrote this down. He had taken to writing things down the moment she said them, not because he distrusted his memory, but because he had lived through several months of instructions that went unimplemented and had developed a strong personal commitment to implementation. Ruth Barrow. When Hobbs told her, stood in her kitchen garden for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Tell her thank you." And then after a pause, "Tell her I mean it." Hobbs told her. Abigail received the message with the straightforward acknowledgement of a person who considers fair treatment a baseline rather than a favor. The summer harvest that year was the best Ashford Hall had produced in a decade. Not because the land was different, the land was the same land. Not because the weather was exceptional. It was a normal Virginia summer, hot and occasionally dry and occasionally generous. The harvest was the best in a decade, because for the first time in a decade, every person working the land had been paid on time, housed adequately, given clear direction, and had a stake in the outcome that went beyond the fear of being replaced. Hobbs told her the final tally in August, sitting across the desk in the study, with the ledger open between them. And when he read the number, she wrote it down in her own ledger, the real one. The locked one she had been keeping since the first year of her marriage. And then she turned to a fresh page and began the new account. The new account looked nothing like the old one. In September, Margaret Hayes opened the schoolhouse to 14 children from the surrounding farms and tenant families. The building was clean and well lit and furnished with materials Abigail had sourced from a Richmond supplier who had been confused but not displeased by the specificity and volume of the order. There were slates, primers, a proper table and chairs, a small iron stove for the coming winter. On the first day, Abigail stood at the back of the room, while Margaret Hayes introduced herself to 14 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, and watched the children's faces as they looked at the room, at the slates, the books, the window that let in enough morning light to read by, and she felt something that was not quite what she had expected to feel. She had expected satisfaction, the clean completion of a plan executed correctly. What she felt was larger than that. She felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but the way you feel the weight of something real and solid when you pick it up with both hands. The weight of a thing that will outlast the person who built it. The schoolhouse would be here when she was not. The children sitting in those chairs would grow up and have children of their own, and send them to this room, and none of them would know or need to know that it had been built, because a man walked into his own harvest supper with another woman's pearl necklace, and his wife had been quietly deciding what to do about it for 3 years. They would only know that the school was there. She slipped out before Margaret Hayes finished her introduction and walked back to the house alone, and she was almost at the door when she heard quick steps behind her. She turned. It was Ruth Barrow's youngest daughter, 7 years old, small and serious, with the focused expression of a child who has been sent on a mission and takes it seriously. "Mama says you forgot this," the girl said, and held out a small cloth parcel. Abigail took it. She opened it. Inside was a jar of preserves strawberry. She thought by the color, with a small folded note tucked beside it. She unfolded the note. Ruth Barrow's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had not had many opportunities to practice it. The note said, "For Miss Whitmore. The strawberries are from the garden. My girls will be in school on Monday. We will not forget what you did here." Abigail stood in the yard with the jar in her hands. The girl was watching her with the serious patience of a 7-year-old waiting to be dismissed. "Tell your mother thank you," Abigail said. "Tell her I'm glad about Monday." The girl nodded gravely and ran back across the yard. Abigail went inside and set the jar on the kitchen windowsill, where the light hit it in the afternoon, and she stood there for a moment looking at it, and she thought about the morning she had left this house. 1 trunk, 1 ledger, the side door. Mrs. Patton's face, and the road to Philadelphia through the summer fields, and her father's hands clasping the pearl at her throat, the morning she first left to become Nathaniel Ashford's wife. The pearl was gone. Clara had taken it, and Clara was somewhere in the northern county being practical, and the pearl was wherever the pearl was, and it did not matter. What her father had given her with that pearl was not the pearl. It was the words that came with it. "You will hold it together. You will protect it. That is not weakness. That is the work of a woman who understands what she is protecting." She had understood. She understood even better now. News of Nathaniel came to her as news does without being sought. A letter from Elias in October mentioned in passing that the monthly allowance draft had been collected from the South Carolina Coastal Office without incident. The following spring, Judge Calloway mentioned at a dinner that he had heard Nathaniel Ashford was living quietly in a small town below Charleston. He said it with the tone of a man offering information he believed was already known, and wanted to confirm, carried no remaining significance. "Is he well?" Abigail asked. Calloway looked at her. "I believe so," he said. "By all accounts he is quiet." "Good," she said, and moved the conversation forward because there was nothing more she needed from that particular account. It was settled. The ledger was closed. What Nathaniel did with the life he had left was his own business, and she genuinely, without performance, wished him the ordinary peace of a man who has learned something the hard way and stopped fighting it. She heard about Clara once from Margaret Dunham, who had it from someone in the northern county. Clara Bellamy and Samuel Crane had been involved briefly and were no longer. Crane had moved his considerable interest to another county entirely. Clara had, by report, gone to stay with a cousin in Charlottesville. Margaret Dunham said this with the particular satisfaction of a woman delivering a verdict she considers just. Abigail said, "I hope she lands well," and meant it. And Margaret Dunham looked at her with the expression of a person recalibrating an expectation because she had expected a more gratifying response and received instead the response of a woman who has been finished with that chapter long enough that it no longer produces the emotions other people are anticipating. Clara Bellamy was not her enemy. She never had been. Clara was a woman who had made choices with what she had the same as everyone, and the choices had not worked out the same as many people. Abigail did not wish her harm. She did not think about her often. She had more interesting things to think about. By the autumn of 1818, 2 years after the harvest supper, 1 year after the Richmond signing, Ashford Hall was something it had not been in the living memory of most of the people who worked it. It was solvent. Genuinely, completely solvent, with operating accounts that ran in the black, and a reserve fund that Elias reviewed each quarter and reported on, with the restrained satisfaction of a man who takes professional pride in a well-managed financial instrument. The tobacco harvest was the second consecutive record. The kitchen garden surplus was being sold at the county market by 3 tenant families, now not one, and producing meaningful income for households that had previously existed at the margin of adequacy. The schoolhouse had 21 students. Margaret Hayes had requested a second room be added for the older children, and Abigail had approved the construction before the letter was finished. In October, at the county harvest gathering, not at Ashford Hall at the Dunham's property, a gathering that had been a county tradition since before anyone present could remember, Judge Calloway stood to make the annual toast. He raised his glass and looked across the assembled families and said, as he said every year, that they were gathered to honor the season and the work of their hands and the community that made both possible. And then he paused, the pause of a man who has something additional to say and has decided to say it, and he looked directly at Abigail and said, "And to those among us who remind us that an estate is only as strong as the integrity of the person who holds it, we are fortunate to have such a person among us." The room raised their glasses. Abigail raised hers. She did not make a speech. She did not need to. She nodded once the way her father nodded when a calculation resolved correctly, when the numbers balanced, when the work had been done with the precision it required, and she drank her cider and let the moment belong to the room rather than to herself. Elias caught her eye from across the table. He almost smiled. The same almost that had been in his expression the day she had said, "Make the offer," and her father had said, "Make the offer," from the doorway. The almost smile of a man who has watched something done correctly and considers correctness its own reward. She almost smiled back. The winter that year was mild. The fields lay quiet under their first frost, resting the way fields rest when they have been worked well and will be ready again in spring. The tenant cabins held their heat. The schoolhouse stove burned steadily through the short, dark afternoons, and the sound of children doing their lessons, the scratch of slates, the low voice of Margaret Hayes at the front of the room, the occasional burst of laughter that a good teacher allows, because learning and joy are not opposed, drifted across the yard in the late mornings. Abigail sat at her desk in the study each morning before the house woke fully with the real ledger open in front of her and the window showing the fields beginning to lighten at the tree line. And she worked through the accounts with the focused satisfaction of a person doing the thing they are built to do in the place they have earned the right to be. Sometimes she thought about what her father had said at the Chestnut Street door when she first left for Virginia. "You are going into a proud man's house. You will hold it together." She had held it together, only not the way either of them had imagined. She had let it fall deliberately, precisely from a controlled height, and then she had walked back in and built something better from the parts that deserved to survive. That was not the plan her father had described. But it was, she thought, what he had actually been preparing her for. Not to endure a proud man's failures, to understand them fully enough to correct them, to have the patience, the knowledge, and the absolute unshakable belief in her own competence to wait until the moment was right and then act without hesitation and without cruelty and without looking back. There were no portraits of Nathaniel Ashford left in the house. There were no portraits of Abigail either, not yet, not hanging, though Elias had suggested it twice, and she had told him twice that she was not finished yet, and she would consider a portrait when the work was done. The work was not done. She was not certain the work would ever be entirely done, which suited her. She was not a woman built for completion. She was built for the next ledger page, the next season, the next thing that needed doing, and was not yet done. Outside, the fields waited. The schoolhouse stood. The tenant cabins held warmth. The horses were fed. the accounts balanced. Abigail Whitmore turned to a fresh page in the ledger, wrote the date, and began. People in that county would in the years that followed forget the name Ashford in the way that names get forgotten when they are attached to nothing worth remembering. They would forget the harvest supper of 1816, or rather, they would remember it only as the beginning of the story, not the story itself. The story itself was the schoolhouse, the fair wages, the repaired cabins, the harvests, the quiet, unshakable daily fact of a woman who had been handed a ruin and had refused to be ruined by it. They stopped calling it Ashford Hall. They called it Whitmore's the way Virginians name things that have earned their names not by declaration, not by purchase, but by the slow accumulation of what has been done there, and by whom, and whether it was done well. It had been done well. A home is not saved by pride or by inheritance or by the loudness of the name above the door. It is saved by the person with the courage to see it clearly, the discipline to act without rage, and the